She was just a waitress, balancing coffee cups and overdue bills, until the day she picked up a stranger's wallet and saw a decades-old photo of her mother inside. Not just any photo, one taken before Ivy was born, in a place her mother swore she'd never been. The man who owned the wallet. A billionaire with everything to lose, and a past he paid to forget. But as Ivy pulls at the threads, one question shatters everything she thought she knew. What if the life she's living was built on someone else's lie? Ivy Monroe had grown used to the rhythms of the Hazel and Pine Cafe, refilling mugs for construction workers before dawn, wiping lipstick off wine glasses for flirty tourists by noon, and sneaking a stale croissant in the back kitchen when the owner wasn't watching. Life wasn't easy, but it was predictable, until the day an elderly man in a tailored overcoat sat down at table 7. He didn't speak much. Just ordered an espresso, black, and watched the world with a gaze too heavy for a man his age. When he paid his bill and shuffled toward the exit, Ivy noticed the wallet he'd left behind. Thick, smooth leather, the kind she'd never be able to afford. She grabbed it, called after him, but he was already at the corner. Running after him through the lunchtime crowd, she dropped the wallet. It spilled open on the sidewalk. Cash fluttered out. But it wasn't the cash that froze her breath, it was the photo that had slipped out behind it. A small, weathered snapshot of a young woman sitting on a sunlit bench, her hand shading her eyes. Her face unmistakable. It was Ivy's mother, Leona. But not as Ivy had ever known her. This woman in the photo was younger, glowing, dressed in clothes Ivy had never seen, glamorous, out of place. And written on the back, in neat cursive, were the words, Evelyn, Summer 92, Hudson Estate. Evelyn. That wasn't her mother's name. That wasn't any name Ivy recognized. Confused, she caught up to the old man and handed him the wallet. "Sir, you dropped this." He gave her a distracted nod, barely glancing at her, his hand clutching the wallet a little too tightly. She hesitated. "I saw the photo. The woman. She looks like I don't know what you're talking about," he cut in, suddenly alert. His voice held a sharp edge now, his tired eyes narrowing into something else. Fear? Anger? Guilt? That photo isn't yours to see. Don't go poking into things you don't understand. With that, he turned and disappeared into a waiting town car that rolled up as if summoned by instinct. Ivy stood there stunned, the cold wind slicing through her apron, the name Hudson Estate ringing in her ears like a ghost bell. Back at the cafe, her hands shook as she poured coffee. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mother had never mentioned any estate, let alone going by a different name. Was it just a coincidence? A look-alike? But something in that old man's eyes told Ivy it wasn't. The next day, she asked her mother casually if she'd ever been to the Hudson River area, or if the name Hudson meant anything to her. Leona's spoon clinked loudly against her teacup. "No." "Why?" she asked too quickly, her tone too clipped. "Just something I read," Ivy lied, but her mother's face had already turned pale, her fingers tightening around the cup. That was all the confirmation Ivy needed. Her mother was hiding something. And that something was tied to the man with the photo. She started researching him, eventually identifying him as Donovan Gray, a reclusive billionaire known for his empire of antique bookstores, publishing houses, and a vast estate 2 towns over that no one ever entered unless they had an invitation or a subpoena. The pieces didn't fit yet, but Ivy could feel them circling something bigger. Why did he have a picture of her mother from before Ivy was born? Why had he called her Evelyn? And why did her mother lie? Ivy didn't know yet what she was getting into, but she knew this much: some ghosts didn't wait to be summoned. They found you when the truth was ready to rise. Ivy had never thought of her mother as a woman with secrets. Leona was the kind of person who bought expired canned goods in bulk and clipped coupons with surgical precision. She worked 2 jobs most of Ivy's life and still found time to sew Halloween costumes by hand. But now, that image, so clear, so solid, had been cracked by the sight of that old photograph. The name Evelyn, the Hudson Estate, the way Leona's face turned ghostly at the mention of it, it all whispered of another life, one Ivy had never been allowed to glimpse. That night, she opened the battered metal lockbox her mother kept beneath her bed, the one supposedly holding only tax documents and appliance warranties. Inside, she found what looked like a pile of utility bills and school records, but beneath them, folded neatly into an envelope yellowed at the edges, was a second photograph. This one was identical to the one Donovan Gray had in his wallet. Ivy's breath caught in her throat. Why would her mother have the same photo, and hide it? Turning it over, she saw the same cursive, the same date, the same signature, Hudson Estate. This time, though, there was an embossed seal faintly visible in the corner, a crest of some kind, nearly rubbed away. Ivy scanned it and began researching it obsessively. Within an hour, she found a match to an old, now-defunct family-owned publishing house that had once operated under the Gray family name, a cornerstone of New York's literary elite in the 80s and 90s. It had been shuttered after mysterious fire, followed by a series of lawsuits involving inheritance disputes that were never fully resolved in court. Everything pointed back to Donovan. Ivy's next move was bolder. She took a part-time job at a catering company that frequently serviced high-profile events and requested any assignment near Hudson Valley. 2 weeks later, she got her break, an Art Foundation gala hosted at Gray Hall, the legendary mansion on the Hudson Estate, now turned private event space. The building was fortress-like, its walls wrapped in ivy and history, with stained glass windows that looked like they hadn't blinked in a century. As she stepped into the ballroom with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, a cold shiver crawled down her back. Every surface gleamed with wealth, the kind of quiet, generational opulence that didn't scream but sighed from the velvet drapes and hand-carved railings. Ivy felt invisible in her server uniform, but that suited her just fine. She maneuvered through the crowd like a ghost, listening, absorbing. In the library, she spotted a portrait that made her stomach flip. It was of a woman with her mother's exact face, hair styled in retro waves, painted in oils with the date 1993 etched at the bottom. The plaque beneath read, Evelyn M., Muse of the Hudson Summer. A wave of nausea hit her. She needed answers. Back home, Ivy scoured newspaper archives and found an obscure mention of a young woman named Evelyn Moreau, a live-in maid at the Gray estate in the early 90s who left suddenly after a scandal involving the youngest Gray son, a man named Silas. The article was vague, buried on page 11, but Ivy printed it anyway. Her hands trembled as she connected the dots. Silas Gray. Donovan's younger brother. Dead now, according to an obituary, but once heir apparent until he disappeared under emotional distress. Ivy's head spun. Could Silas have been her real father? Why was Donovan the one with the photo? Had there been a love triangle? A cover-up? Her mother had said nothing. Absolutely nothing. The next morning, Ivy asked her mother about Evelyn Moreau. Leona went still, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Where did you hear that name?" she whispered, her voice suddenly so small it didn't sound like her. Ivy told her she found a reference online, that she looked like the woman in the article. Leona didn't deny it. Instead, she stood up, walked to the sink, and stared out the window as if replaying something only she could see. "That's not a name I use anymore," she said finally. "And that's not a life I ever wanted you to know about." Ivy begged for clarity, but Leona wouldn't speak further, only muttering, "Some truths only hurt the ones we try to protect." That sentence echoed in Ivy's ears long after. Desperate now, Ivy broke into the town's historical archives and unearthed boxes of letters, photos, and ledger entries related to the Gray estate. In one, she found a guest list for a 1992 summer gala with the name Evelyn Moreau listed as staff. On the back of a napkin preserved inside a box of memorabilia, scrawled in rushed ink, were the words, "He'll never let you go. Don't trust Donovan." Ivy's chest tightened. Her mother hadn't just worked at that estate. She'd been running from it. And Donovan Gray, with all his power and silence, knew more than he was admitting. Ivy realized she wasn't just tracing her family history. She was untangling someone else's legacy of control, manipulation, and shame. She had entered a story she hadn't written, and it was rewriting her right back. The deeper Ivy dug, the more she realized how many layers were stitched into the fabric of the Gray legacy. Layers thick with secrets, stitched with blood, silenced with money. The estate was no longer just a haunted shell of old wealth. It was a living archive of stories people had tried to bury, and her mother's was just one of them. Ivy kept her catering job but began asking subtle questions of those who had been working the estate longest. Landscapers, cleaners, even drivers who remembered the Gray brothers from decades ago. Most were too afraid or too loyal to say much, but one older housekeeper, a woman named Bernice, offered a single comment that sent Ivy reeling. "I remember Evelyn. She left in the middle of the night. Pregnant. That's all I'll say. Pregnant." Ivy's world reeled, and her hands began to tremble so violently she had to step into the hallway to catch her breath. Her mother had fled the estate carrying a child, and Donovan had that child's mother's photo in his wallet 30 years later. Ivy knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was the child. But there was no record of her birth at the estate. Nothing tied her name to the Gray family, not even a whisper. And that was intentional. Someone had made sure of that. Ivy visited the county clerk's office and pulled the birth records from her hospital. Her mother was listed as the sole parent. The father's name was left blank. But someone had signed the insurance authorization. S. Gray. The signature had been crossed out, probably after he backed out, but it was there, faint under the layers of ink and erasure. That was enough. Ivy needed proof, more than whispers and faded ink. So she made a bold, irreversible move. She mailed in a DNA kit, one of those direct-to-consumer types, and registered it under an alias. She used a strand of her mother's hair from an old brush and managed to obtain a water glass that Donovan had sipped from and discarded at a public charity luncheon. It was a long shot, but she had to try. While she waited for the results, Ivy started infiltrating the estate's public archives. She claimed to be a journalist researching the literary history of the Hudson Valley, which got her access to restricted records, including old correspondence and payroll ledgers from the estate's golden years. She found multiple entries for Evelyn Moreau, employed as a personal maid to Silas Gray, with notes indicating extended stays in the West Wing guest house. There were weeks where she received no pay, accompanied by handwritten notes, compensated off-ledger. Private matter. Ivy found a faded letter, never mailed, written in her mother's handwriting but addressed to no one. "He said he loved me. He said we'd run away together. But when his brother found out, everything changed. I can't trust either of them anymore. I'm leaving tonight." That letter made Ivy's hands go cold. What had Donovan done? Had he threatened her mother? Had he paid her off? Or worse? A few days later, her DNA results came in with a match. 99.9% paternal link to Silas Gray. Ivy sat staring at the screen, her ears roaring, the edges of her vision pulsing like static. Her father was a man she'd never met, who had died under mysterious circumstances and been buried in a closed-casket funeral attended only by Donovan and a handful of associates. What had happened to him? Rumors suggested a suicide, others whispered overdose, but no one close to the family had ever spoken on record. Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that Donovan knew more than he let on. She returned to Bernice, the old housekeeper, and begged her to share what really happened. The woman hesitated, eyes darting nervously. Then, in a whisper that barely made it past her lips, she said, "Silas wanted to marry her. But Donovan said it would ruin the family. So they made a deal. Evelyn disappears, and Silas stays. But he never recovered. You remind me of him." Ivy left the estate that night feeling like she was walking with someone else's memories stitched into her skin. She now knew who her father was. She now knew her mother had fled for her life. But what she didn't know was why Donovan still carried that photo. Or why, if he'd wanted Evelyn gone, he'd kept her face close all these years. There had to be more. She started scouring the business history of Donovan's companies and discovered a recurring transfer. Funds wired monthly to an anonymous account that matched her mother's known alias. Leona had always said she worked 2 jobs to support them, but the numbers never added up. Now Ivy understood. Donovan had been paying her off, quietly, for years. But why? Guilt? Control? Or something darker? She traced the payment trail back to a trust fund created the same month she was born. It was structured to appear as part of a charitable outreach program. But buried in the fine print was the name of the trustee, Donovan Gray. That meant he'd known from the very beginning. Known about Ivy. Known she was Silas's child. And still, he said nothing. Still, he kept the photo. Ivy felt like the ground beneath her was vanishing. She wasn't just discovering the truth. She was trespassing into a story written in shame and sealed with power. And if Donovan had been hiding this for 30 years, then she had to ask herself the most terrifying question yet. What else had he buried to protect the Grey name? It wasn't just truth Ivy had uncovered, it was a landmine. Within days of confirming her connection to Silas Grey, word began to circulate in ways she hadn't intended. An anonymous tipster had sent a redacted version of the DNA results to a gossip blog known for cracking elite scandals, and though Ivy had no proof of who leaked it, she suspected it had come from someone inside the estate trying to preempt her. The headline read, "Waitress claims blood ties to billionaire legacy. Is Donovan Gray's fortune at risk?" What followed was a storm. The Grey family issued a terse statement denying the claim outright, branding it a cruel fabrication by someone exploiting a grieving family's name. But it didn't stop there. Ivy came home one night to find her front door slightly ajar, the lock scratched. Nothing was missing, but the top drawer of her desk had been rifled through. Her laptop was warm, as if recently used. Her heart pounded, her skin prickled. Someone had been inside, and they hadn't needed to take anything. They were looking for something specific. Or they were leaving a message. The next morning, Ivy received a cease and desist letter from the Grey estate's legal team. It accused her of defamation, unauthorized access to private property, and misuse of confidential information. Her hands shook as she held the thick envelope. But it was the final line that chilled her. Any further attempts to interfere with the Grey legacy will be met with the fullest extent of legal and personal action. Personal action. The phrase slithered across the page like a threat wearing a silk tie. Ivy knew they weren't just trying to protect Donovan. They were protecting everything the name Grey represented. In their eyes, she wasn't family. She was a loose thread, a danger, a scandal in the making. Her phone lit up with unknown numbers. Her workplace reported a spike in random visits by inspectors. Her mother, who had remained painfully silent since the confrontation, received a visit from a foundation representative offering her a substantial sum to sign a non-disclosure agreement and quietly relocate to another state. But Leona refused. Ivy saw the envelope on the kitchen table, unopened. Her mother looked exhausted, as if the years had caught up with her in a week. "They think silence is safety," she said. "But silence is what buried your father." Ivy pressed her for more. The full story. The unedited version. Her mother poured herself tea she didn't drink and began talking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Silas loved me. I know people say that kind of thing all the time, but he did. We were young. I was naive. He had a wildness in him, a sadness. He said his brother always saw him as weak. That he'd never be allowed to make his own decisions. We used to talk about leaving. Running away. But one day, Donovan found a letter Silas wrote to me. Everything changed. There was a family meeting behind closed doors. I wasn't allowed in. When Silas came out, he was different. Cold. Detached. He said I needed to leave immediately, that they'd arranged a job for me out west, that I'd be taken care of. I didn't know I was pregnant yet. I just left. It was like being erased." Ivy listened in stunned silence. "I tried writing to him once," Leona continued. "I never heard back. I thought maybe he changed his mind. Or maybe he died. I didn't know until years later what really happened. He overdosed. Or so they say. I never believed it." Silas was sad, but he wasn't broken. The revelation painted everything in darker tones. Donovan hadn't just been a bystander, he'd been the architect of separation, the gatekeeper of legacy, the quiet enforcer of silence. Ivy wondered what else had been scrubbed from the record. She hired a lawyer, an old friend of her late grandfather's, who agreed to help pro bono after hearing the story. He filed a petition to review the trust under fraud allegations and requested a court order for a formal paternity inquiry. The Grey estate retaliated swiftly. Paparazzi began showing up at Ivy's job, and anonymous online accounts smeared her as a liar, a con artist, a fame-hungry fraud. At the same time, Ivy's lawyer received a disturbing message. Someone had offered to buy his silence, cash in a brown envelope delivered to his office desk with no note, just a seal from an elite club Donovan once chaired. The lawyer didn't back down. Instead, he forwarded the envelope to the press, adding fuel to a fire that was already smoldering beneath the surface of elite society. As the legal battle intensified, Ivy began to wonder whether any amount of justice could truly correct the imbalance. Blood didn't always buy belonging. And truth, she was learning, didn't always bring peace. Donovan Gray hadn't spoken to her since their first encounter. But one afternoon, she received a private message from a law firm stating that Donovan had requested an off-the-record meeting. No cameras. No recordings. Just the two of them. Against every voice of caution, Ivy agreed. She met him in the library of a private club in Manhattan. Opulent, suffocating with old money and older secrets. He looked older than before, like the years had suddenly caught up to him. He didn't greet her. Just slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs, some Ivy had never seen before. Her mother, pregnant. Her father, Silas, holding her as a baby. Receipts of financial support. And finally, a typed confession. A notarized document signed by Donovan, outlining how he orchestrated the separation, faked letters from Silas, and silenced Leona with threats of legal ruin. Ivy stared at him, stunned. "Why now?" she asked. Donovan looked at her like a man sinking beneath his own legacy. "Because I'm dying," he said quietly. "And I don't want to take the worst parts of myself to the grave without trying to make one thing right." Ivy didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Truth had come, but it came shackled to pain. She left the folder on the table and walked away, unsure if she felt vindicated or just broken. That night, she stood at her window, watching the streetlights flicker against the wind, and whispered her father's name for the first time. Silas. Not a myth. Not a ghost. A man. Her father. And a memory that refused to be buried. The silence in the kitchen was suffocating. Ivy stood across from her mother, folder in hand, its contents still warm from the copier. Each page a weight pulling her deeper into the undertow of revelation. The confession Donovan had given her had answered so many questions, yet none of the answers brought her peace. If anything, they cracked open a whole new realm of betrayal. What stunned her most wasn't the document itself. It was that her mother had known. Not just the outlines of it. All of it. The payments, the threats, the letters forged in Donovan's hand. Ivy had gone to war for the truth, and the person she'd been trying to protect had never told her she was already living in a lie. Leona sat at the table, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap like she was preparing for a sermon. Ivy could barely speak. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window where sunlight filtered through the curtain lace in golden ribbons, and then turned back with eyes too tired to cry. "Yes," she said finally. "I knew. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to carry the weight I had to." The confession Donovan had signed had mentioned a final letter, one Silas wrote days before his death, one that had never been delivered. Ivy asked about it, and Leona's eyes flickered. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a faded blue envelope, the kind Ivy had only ever seen in vintage movies. It was sealed with a wax crest, untouched. "I never opened it," Leona said. "It was the last thing I had of him that hadn't been tainted." Ivy broke the seal with shaking hands. Inside was a letter written in a script so careful it made her heart ache. Silas had written of dreams unfulfilled, of nights he spent imagining a life with Leona and the child he was told he'd never see. He'd begged for forgiveness, blamed himself for being too weak to fight his brother, and ended with a single sentence that burned itself into Ivy's heart. "If our child is born, tell them I loved them before I even knew their name." Ivy pressed the letter to her chest like a talisman, the words vibrating inside her bones. "Why would you hide this from me?" she asked, finally, the edges of her voice fraying. Leona's hand shook as she picked up her teacup but didn't drink. "Because love isn't always clean, Ivy. And sometimes, protecting someone means becoming the villain in their story." It wasn't rage Ivy felt, it was something more complex. Grief, betrayal, and a twisted kind of empathy. Her mother had lived her entire life under someone else's terms, her story ghostwritten by men with money and power, forced to erase her love, her child's lineage, her own voice. She hadn't just been silenced. She'd participated in the silence, convinced it was the only way to protect Ivy from the cruelty of the truth. But now Ivy saw the toll. The broken spirit. The constant fear. The loneliness disguised as resolve. She began to understand that her mother had paid a price no money from Donovan Gray could ever erase. It had cost her everything that made her feel human. For decades, Leona had swallowed the story and never let a single word escape. Ivy saw it now, not as cowardice, but as a terrible, impossible choice. Later that week, Ivy returned to Donovan's private club, folder in hand, ready to ask the one question that had haunted her since reading the letter. "Why did you keep the photo?" she asked. He was seated in the same leather chair, a blanket draped over his legs, more fragile than before. "Because I needed to remember what I destroyed," he said simply. "Every time I looked at it, I was reminded that legacy is a house of cards, and I pulled out the wrong one." He coughed hard, long, his chest rattling. Silas wasn't supposed to die. He wasn't even supposed to be unhappy. I thought I was saving him from a scandal. I didn't understand that I was murdering his future in slow motion. Ivy wanted to hate him, but she saw no power in him now. Just a man at the edge of death, buried alive by his own guilt. She stood, ready to leave, but paused. "You never tried to find me," she said. "Even when you knew." He didn't look up. "Because I didn't think I deserved to." That night, Ivy sat beside her mother and read Silas's letter out loud. The words broke Leona open, sobs racking her body like she was finally letting go of a breath she'd been holding for 3 decades. They cried together, mother and daughter, for the man they'd both lost and the pieces of themselves they'd buried along with him. And in the space between those sobs, a strange peace began to settle. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first crack in the wall between them. Ivy knew then that her fight had never really been about money or recognition. It had always been about truth, rescuing it from the ashes, dragging it into the light, and setting it free no matter how much it hurt. She wasn't just reclaiming her past. She was giving it shape, giving it voice, making sure that the story of Silas Gray and Evelyn Moreau wasn't lost beneath the rubble of silence and shame. And that realization felt like justice, even if the world wouldn't see it that way. Donovan Gray died on a rainy Thursday morning, his heart finally succumbing to the slow decay of guilt that no medicine could ever treat. There were no grand announcements, no public mourning from the elite circles he once ruled. Just a quiet statement from his estate that he had passed peacefully, and that all affairs would be handled privately. But what followed was anything but private. Ivy received a letter the very next day, hand-delivered by a courier in a crisp suit who wouldn't say a word, only tipped his hat and disappeared down the street. Inside was a formal invitation to the reading of Donovan's final will, an event scheduled to be held in the Gray Estate's private library, the same room where Ivy had first seen her mother's painted likeness hanging like a relic from a life stolen. She didn't know what to expect, but something deep in her bones told her this would be the last page in a chapter she had spent her entire life unknowingly trapped inside. She arrived at the estate under a sky that threatened another storm. The old house looked even more ancient now, like it had aged with Donovan, its stone walls weary from years of holding secrets. Inside were lawyers, notaries, and 3 grim-faced individuals Ivy recognized from news photos. Donovan's niece, the CFO of his publishing company, and his personal attorney. No one greeted her. No one offered a seat. She remained standing near the doorway until the executor, an older woman with silver hair pulled tight and eyes sharp as razors, began to read. Most of the will was predictable, assets divided among business partners, a foundation named after Donovan's late mother, and several large donations to literary institutions. But then the room shifted as the executor's voice paused, and a new page was turned. "To Ivy Monroe," she read slowly, "daughter of Silas Gray, and the last unacknowledged heir of this family, I leave not wealth, but the truth I denied her for most of her life." Gasps rippled through the room. Ivy's hands clenched at her sides. The executor continued. "Included in this final statement is the release of all trust fund documentation, correspondence, and notarized testimony detailing the events surrounding Silas Gray's relationship with Evelyn Moreau, as well as my own interference. It is my wish that Ivy be given full access to the estate's private archive and, should she choose, the authority to publish the Gray family history as she sees fit. I offer no conditions, no restrictions, only what should have been hers by birthright, The story. A heavy silence followed. The niece stood abruptly, shouting about forged documents and delusions, but the attorney raised a hand, silencing her with the calm detachment only the law could afford. The will was clear, and Donovan's confession had been made ironclad. There was no more denying who Ivy was. No more burying the past beneath marble and mahogany. She didn't receive a check, a house, or a company, but what she'd been given was more powerful. The one weapon that had always eluded her family: agency over the truth. Over the following weeks, Ivy found herself sitting in the estate library for hours on end, sifting through old files, dusty letters, torn photographs, and journals that belonged to men who once thought themselves gods. She pieced together a fuller picture, not just of her father and mother's tragic love, but of the poisonous culture that had surrounded them. She found Silas's notebooks, filled with passages that broke her. Poems about a future that never came, drawings of a baby girl with her mother's eyes, a letter he never sent titled "For the Day She Finds Me." Ivy read every word like a prayer. And then she began writing herself. She poured her heart into a manuscript, not a tell-all, but a story, a reclamation. A novel based on the truth, cloaked in fiction but pulsing with real blood. She titled it The Forgotten Daughter, and when it was finally published under her name, no pseudonym, no anonymity, it climbed to the top of the literary charts, not because of its drama, but because of its soul. Readers connected with its pain, its longing, its quiet war against erasure. Leona attended the launch in a modest blue dress, her hair pinned up like it had been in the photo from the estate, and for the first time in years, she looked unburdened. Ivy thanked her mother on stage, not for the lies, but for the survival. "She did what she had to so I could live freely," she said to the crowd. But the cost of silence is heavy, and someone always ends up paying for it. Afterward, Ivy returned to the grey estate one last time. Alone. She wandered the halls not as an intruder or outsider, but as someone who had seen the full architecture of power and chose not to be seduced by it. She visited the portrait of Evelyn and stood there until the sky outside darkened. Then, without a word, she removed the small plaque beneath it and replaced it with one of her own, etched simply with two names: Leona. Silas. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't justice. It was something more sacred. Memory reclaimed. In the weeks that followed, inquiries came in from journalists, podcasters, even filmmakers. But Ivy declined them all. The story had been told. Her story. She didn't need to explain it anymore. What she did instead was start a foundation, one that offered legal and financial aid to women forced into silence by the powerful. She named it Evelyn's Echo. And in the quiet corners of her apartment, when the world wasn't watching, Ivy sometimes pulled out the letter from her father and read it again, each time discovering a new layer of meaning, as if Silas had somehow known that one day his words would be all she had to go on. In the end, Ivy didn't inherit land, stocks, or buildings. She inherited something far more enduring: the truth, unshackled, imperfect, and entirely her own. And for the first time in her life, she knew who she was. Not just the daughter of a forgotten man, not just the product of secrets, but the woman who turned those buried histories into light. She had been born into a story she never asked for, but she would die knowing she finished it on her terms.